Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. Hey, I want to pitch my book. I'm only going to pitch it for 2 more days. It's been out for like a year, but it's on Amazon, and I got to pay these storage fees. It's like $100 a month, and now they're doubling it, so I got to pay $200 a month. I don't want to do it anymore, so I'm taking it off Amazon. So this is your last chance. Imagine Jack and the History Kids. Here's the very, very short of it. So about this kid, Jack, and he is beat all his video games. He's really bored. He's laying on the couch all the time. And his mom tells him to go outside, use your imagination. He's like, that's super lame. I don't want to use my imagination. So he goes outside, and his buddy, Paul, is riding his bike down. And he's saying, the British are coming, the British are coming. So Jack hops on the back of the bike, and then you turn the page on, it's 1775 Boston. It's Paul Revere, and they're riding through Boston. And then they get to the river, and they can't cross the river. So now it's back to just like regular kids with their bike again. But there's their buddy George. George coming down on his dad's fishing boat. I'll take you across the river. Boom, they get in. It's George Washington crossing the icy Delaware. And then they go on the rest of their adventures, and they got to get home by dinner time. And it's getting late, and what are they going to do? Well, they come across their buddy Neil Armstrong, and he's the soapbox derby king, and they get him home by dinner. And then they go and they tell their parents about all the wonderful times they had using their imagination with their friends. That's the point of the book. And they come across a bunch of, so George Washington, Thomas Edison, Paul Revere, James Hill. We learn about James Hill in the book, and Amelia Earhart and Neil Armstrong. Imagine Jack and History Kids at 1776. It's on Amazon for 1 more week only, and Prime free delivery and all that. So I've been saying the last few weeks that there's 3 fail-safes in a society. You got God, culture, and community. I'm putting those together. And then the family. And when those 3 are removed, then all that's left is the police and the government, jails, right? That's the last fail. And I want to be clear, the first 3, they don't fail. They were removed. It's not that these first 3, God, community, and family, fail. They're not there anymore. And if you rely on just the police, the last fail-safe, it's not going to work, right? There's going to be chaos. Now, if you remove the police, right, and abolish the police, well, then it's like a total chaos, right? Then now you got, I saw this video the other day of looters stealing computers from an Apple store. And this guy's walking out with a computer, and then someone comes up and beats him up and takes the computer. And then someone beats him up, and then a group of people beat him up, and then the video ends, right? But it's like looters looting from looters, and whoever's bigger and more willing to fight and use their gun wins, right? And that's what Thomas Hobbes wrote about. That's why he called that type of life nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Right? That's what life is in its state of nature, when there's no community and when there are no laws. That's the state of nature, and that's what we're moving towards, right? Because we've removed these fail-safes. Now, I didn't come up with these fail-safes, right? And I don't think I stole this from anyone specifically, but it's not a super original thought. But one of our listeners, I've been mentioning it a bunch, and one of our listeners sent me this sermon from the great John MacArthur. John MacArthur, one of my favorite pastors. And he gave this sermon in 2015 called How God Restrains Evil in the World. Now, it's an hour long, and I obviously cannot do the justice that it deserves. So please Google it and watch the whole thing. How God Restrains Evil in the World. But he says there's 4 restraints to human nature. 4 restraints that keep society functioning. And I just want to go through them here real quick so we get a firm understanding of it. Very first thing to note, because progressive culture has infected everybody's minds with this. So we got to get this one straight. We are all sinners in a broken world. Period. We got to stop with this progressive utopia nonsense that we're on a moral arc towards utopia, and any failing along the way is proof that we don't have a big enough government. That's the idea. People are not inherently good. People are inherently broken and flawed and sinful. We are sinners in a broken world. Just look how Chaz is going in Seattle, okay? That's human nature on display. But here's what MacArthur says. He said, so God, because of that, God has built into human life barriers, restraints to mitigate this evil, to mitigate this corruption, to subdue sinful passion and expression so that man could make a society and be civilized and enjoy his creation and find happiness and peace and a measure of joy and gratitude. These restraints are absolutely critical. Where these restraints function as God intended them to function, life is good. People enjoy common graces. Life is rich and God is thanked. Where these restraints are assaulted, corrupted, diminished, rebelled against, society is on the brink of self-destruction. Basic to the well-being of humanity are these 4 powerful restraints. Okay, let's do it. Number one, the conscience. This is your personal restraint. So the Greek word for conscience means self-knowledge. And self-consciousness, it's only human. No other creation has a conscience. And when people do evil, when people do bad things, your conscience goes into actions. Your conscience sends sirens out. Physically, we understand this phenomenon, right? Nobody likes pain, but we should be grateful for it. Pain's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? It tells you you're doing something that's a problem, right? If you didn't feel pain, it'd be a horrible thing. I remember, so the easy analogy, you put your hand on a stove, it's hot, it tells you to take it off, right? Otherwise your hand will burn. I remember I was a kid and I saw an episode of Maury Povich, and they had this girl. First of all, they had some girl who was allergic to oxygen or something but then the next one was this girl had no pain. She couldn't feel pain ever. And I remember thinking that, I was like, wow, that's awesome, no pain ever. But then she told some story about where she, one time she sat on a furnace and she didn't even know it. And she got all I think 4th degree burns or whatever all over her body because she didn't even know she was in pain. That's a horrible thing. Physically, it's a horrible thing to not have pain. But we've done that with our conscience. We've perverted our conscience so that we don't feel pain. It's critical you feel pain. It's a gift from God. Pain is a gift from God. Tells you got to stop what you're doing. Tells you got to get some help. Tells you got to remedy something. And conscience is pain in the moral area. Conscience screams at you, says, stop doing what you're doing. It's a gift from God. Now we can screw it up. We twist it, we pervert it, we reverse it. That's why the Bible says, I forget where it is, but changing sweet for bitter, bitter for sweet, light for dark, dark for light, good for bad, bad for good. We flip it around, people get confused. Our pop culture makes a new morality, right? In our education system, in music, TV, kids have a twisted morality and your conscience becomes confused. You don't know. And then if there's any shred of it left, society makes it illegitimate, right? Society comes in and says, oh, hey, you shouldn't feel guilty about that. No, you do you. You be you, right? You're who you are. You need to be proud about this thing you're doing, right? That's how you live. You do your thing. Nobody can tell you what to do. You shouldn't feel guilty. Guilt is bad. Guilt is wrong. You don't feel guilty. You should be proud about this terrible, awful thing you're doing that you shouldn't be doing. So we reverse morality, and then any shred of it that's left, we crush it by delegitimizing our conscience that's screaming at us. And then everyone's confused. So there you've successfully removed the very first restraint in a civilized society. Now, as you know, progressives see this as liberating, right? Progressives, atheists in particular, but they see religion and morality as you being shackled. You're shackled by a meanie God. He's a real meanie head, and he's preventing you from doing what you want to do. So we got to break free from the chains of religion. How's that going for you? Where's your lack of morality gotten you? You happy? I was thinking, should I go on this whole thing or not? I don't know. I think we'll leave that there. But I guess I was going to say, kids need boundaries. Kids want boundaries. They pretend like they don't want boundaries. So you give them, little kids, you give them the freedom and they freak out. They want boundaries. And adults, humans, we want boundaries as well. Anyway, that's the first one, conscience. Second restraint is the family. So the conscience is personal. The family is a relationship restraint. Animals who are born, many of them, they walk right away, right? Like a horse, born, boom, walking. Humans, we're born, can't do nothing. Can't do anything for years. Our third kid is John. He's 4 months old. We still got to carry him everywhere. Start pulling your weight around here, kid. But it's a good thing that it's like that. The restraint of family. So the great Walter Williams has finally spoken up on what's going on in society right now. He said when he was growing up, he's 85 now, his dad left the family, he and his sister, his mom and his sister, when he was 3. And they all lived in the housing projects in Philly. And he was the only kid in the neighborhood who did not have his dad around. He was the only one. And now, in 1880, I think he said 1880, he He said somewhere between 85 and 95% of black kids lived in a two-parent home. In 1880, so it's one generation after slavery, 85 to 95% of black kids lived in a two-parent home. Today, it's less than a third. Broken families are devastating to society. They're devastating to individuals and to society at large. And the reason they're devastating to society is because that second restraint is removed. Here's MacArthur. We have an undisciplined, overly rebellious youth culture that is completely alienated from families. That's the product of all kinds of shattered, broken families or non-families who wear violations of the Fifth Amendment like a badge of honor. Isn't it bad that this is how little we're taught this stuff? Like I was like, oh, Fifth Amendment. Oh, context. Or Fifth Amendment, Fifth Commandment. I was like, okay, I think it's probably honor your father and mother based on context, but it's what a shame that we just don't know this because it's not in our schools anymore and we're not taught this stuff in the home like we should be. Just listen to some of the rap music, how they refer to their mothers. Devastation of marriage, devastation of the family shatters this divinely designed restraint. So whether you're devastating marriage or whether you're failing to instruct children in a cohesive home or whether you're failing to discipline them, you're just moving society towards its own death. Conscience, family, there's two more. We'll do it next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Study Crusaders, let's keep this party going. John MacArthur, sermon 2015, How God Restrains Evil in the World. He says there's 4 restraints, and we've systematically removed all of them, and we wonder why we are where we are right now. So he talks in this sermon about, and you should definitely Google it and watch the whole thing, it's excellent, but he talks about nihilism. Nihilism is the total rejection of established laws and institutions. That's the dictionary definition. That's us right now, isn't it? Right? That's critical theory. Critical race theory, critical gender theory. Critical theory is the big umbrella of what's being taught in academia for the last 25 years, really, but really ramped up the last decade or so. Critical, it means the deconstruction of everything in our society. Everything that is traditional and therefore white-centric and therefore racist must be torn down. Total rejection of established laws and institutions. That's nihilism, and that's where we are right now. Okay, so number 1, conscience. Number 2, family. Number 3, civil authority. John MacArthur says, biblically, the prime duty of civil authority is not charity, it's not welfare, it's not economics. The primary duty of the civil authority is the moral well-being of its citizens. Its job is to restrain sinners and reward those who do good so that we can all be civilized. And in MacArthur, he said, and enjoy a measure of peace and joy in life of God's creation. And civil government has a little more tools at its disposal, right? So the law of God in the heart, right? That's one. That's your conscience. That's like guilt, right? That's the threat. That's the penalty. The family has a threat, right? The rod, as the Bible says, discipline the disobedient child, right? Civil government has a threat as well, an even greater one, perhaps, a deadly one. Even. And MacArthur makes the point that civil government is a God-ordained institution to restrain sinners. Now, this truth right here out of the Bible is really tough for Americans. It's 1 Peter 2:13. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Now, the Greek word for institution is God-ordained institution. So Peter's writing this at a brutal time under Roman rule. Here's what MacArthur says. These believers were accused of rebellion against Rome. They were being accused of atheism because they didn't worship Caesar. They were accused of cannibalism because of the Lord's table. They were accused of immorality, incest, damaging trade, wrecking homes because somebody would come to Christ and the other person wouldn't, and that would make a difficult marriage. They were accused of hating the world, disloyal to Caesar. They were even accused of leading a slave rebellion, all right? So Peter wrote this at a very difficult time, and he still said to submit. Why? Because God has placed civil government, even with its failures, even when it gets twisted. But he put it there to restrain evil. And it's not going to be perfect, but you have to submit. And it's God who designed it, and it's there to keep society safe. Tough for Americans, right? Because we were born out of tyranny, or rebelling against tyranny. But, You decide if you want to follow that in the Bible or not. But here's the point. Civil government is so important, it's so essential, that the moment it ceases to exist, it immediately exists again. Right? They said, MacArthur makes the point, there's no time in which there's no civil authority. And if there's ever a time where like government's removed or authority doesn't exist anymore, he said the wretchedness of the human heart explodes in deadly force. Again, to bring back Chaz, as soon as they became autonomous and left civilized society, it made this power vacuum that's going to be filled through force by someone else, right? They're going to have their own warlord who's eventually going to take over and rule by gun. We see it in the Middle East, right? You take down one leader, someone even worse fills the void. There's never a time when there is no civil authority, ever. So pick one. The fourth restraint is the church, which transforms the heart. So you have the conscience and the church. Those are internal safeguards. And then you have the family and police, and those are the external safeguards. And they're all there to restrain evil. Now, the thing is, all of them can be manipulated and twisted and broken and removed entirely. And when that happens, bad things are going to happen. So where are we? Well, we got broken families. No internal heart change ever, right? It's all you do you. You're perfect just the way you are. No, you're not. Right? That's one of the biggest lies ever, is you're perfect. No, you are definitely not perfect. You're not even close to, you're like light years away. You need to change a lot about yourself, quite frankly. Me too, of course. So there's no heart transformation anymore, because you do you. No conscience, right? We've twisted that morality. Did you see the video of the guy walking down the street in New York City the other day? This guy, he's walking down, this old lady, got a 92-year-old lady walking down the street. This guy's coming down. They're just everyone's walking casually, and he just punches her in the face. He just pops her right in the side of the face, keeps walking. So this is a couple days ago, they got him. He's a 31-year-old guy. He's been arrested. How many times do you think? How many times do you think this guy's been arrested before? If you asked me that, because it was so weird and cruel that like, he was definitely been arrested. So I'd say maybe 5 times. Maybe this guy's been arrested 5 times before. 101 times. He's 31. He's been arrested 101 times. He's a registered sex offender who's been arrested 101 times. What are you talking about? You know, Cuomo released a bunch of prisoners from Rikers Island, right? Because of COVID. 250 of them who were released have committed 450 crimes in just the last month or two, right? Since they've been released. 250 people have committed 450 crimes. And then they get arrested and there's no bail anymore because of COVID and other things. So they're just released again. Arrested, released, arrested, released, arrested, released. What is going on? So that's a breakdown of everything, right? That's again, a systematic removal of everything. Now all you have, so if you get rid of the family, you get rid of conscience, you get rid of the church, you're only gonna have the police left. But then you have progressives come in and they get rid of the police. And they get rid of the justice system, and they get rid of jails, and they get rid of prisons, and they start letting this guy out of jail 101 times. And yes, of course, he's going to punch a 92-year-old lady in the face for no reason. Because he's been failed. I don't want to make him a victim. For the 92-year-old lady, the 4 safeguards that would allow her to walk down the street in peace have been removed in that kid's life. To the point where now she gets punched in the face. All right, I want to go because we got a amazing guest coming up next. Just to wrap it up, into the individual, how does MacArthur put this? He says, submit to the law of God and your conscience. To the child, submit to the law of God and your parents. To the citizen, submit to the law of God as enforced by civil authorities. And submit to the law of God and the church. Americans don't care much for any of them right now. Not any one of those, let alone all 4. But we're wondering why we are where we are right now in today's society. There should be no question why. And really, therefore, there should be no question as to how to solve it either. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, there's so much confusion out there. It's unbelievable. And I just value people so much who bring clarity in moments like this. And our next guest is one of those men. He's an assistant professor at Kentucky State University. He's got 2 books, Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Professor Wilfred Riley. Mr. Riley, how are you, brother?
Doing really well. Good to be on the show.
And I should note my favorite Twitter handle, WillDeBeast630. So you can follow the professor at WillDeBeast630. Professor, again, we're all confused. You have clarity. What is the number one thing that if you could just scream from the rooftops and get people to understand and see, what would that fact be?
Well, one thing I try to do as an academic is bring actual knowledge, numbers to the table to a lot of these debates that divide, say, whites and African Americans, the social classes, so on. So a lot of these things that we're seeing in society today aren't based, to me, on an understanding of reality. When we hear from the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a movement that's inspired by real belief, real passion, but some of these claims, like Attorney Crump's claim that there is a legalized genocide against people of color, that's absolutely counter to facts you can find out through academic study. If you go to the Washington Post police shootings database, for example, the total number of unarmed black men that were actually killed by law enforcement officers in the most recent year on record, that's 2017, was 15. The total number of unarmed individuals, period, of all races, the majority, as always, were Caucasian and Hispanic, that were killed by Leos was 56. Only about 1,000 people, armed or unarmed, and most of those were individuals with a gun or a knife attacking the officer, were shot or otherwise killed in interactions with police. 229 were African American. Even that slight discrepancy, we're about 15% of the population. We made up 22% of the shooting victims, goes away if you make a simple adjustment for crime rate. So understanding the actual facts, the actual realities that exist out there in the ether often really changes the debate around a lot of these social questions. And this gets into even more complex issues. For example, are gaps that we see in society due to, for example, institutional racism? Again, they're facts that have to be brought to the table before people can simply take an angry, opinion-based position.
Okay, all right. So before we even, I want to ask for an example of that and systematic racism and all the rest. But sure. As you're sharing this truth and these facts and wisdom, it's so contrary to every narrative that exists out there. Like, you must be so wildly frustrated when you're hearing all this and you're like, like, don't you guys know this? Like, what do your students think, right? Your students come into you probably more radicalized because of everything they're hearing in the culture. And then they come to your class and you share what you just shared with us. Like, their brains must explode.
Well, I've had great students. I've really enjoyed teaching at Kentucky State, which is, a top 200 university, historically black college. Teaching is a great thing to be able to do, to be blessed enough to do. But for me, again, I think definitely you do see an intense reaction to the actual facts often when they're brought to the table. And I think the facts around a lot of these issues surprise people. The entire idea that there's substantial racial conflict in the USA is not real. Something, you mentioned my Twitter handle, something that I gained a fair amount of attention for saying on Twitter is that violent interracial crime, at least between black and white people, is 5% of crime. And that's frankly not controversial. There were 12 million crimes on the record last year. If we're talking about violent crimes or serious property crimes, that's according to what's called the BJS report, the National Crime Report. And only about 600,000 of those involved violent encounters between blacks and whites. And that's individuals on either side attacking. And getting almost into taboo territory here, in a typical year, including last year, those incidents are going to be 70, 80+% black on white rather than vice versa. That's not even especially surprising. A glib one sentence is there are more white people and they have more money. But it certainly defeats the narrative that there's this epidemic of violence, Barbecue Becky and Pool Party Paula and Coupon Carl and Central Park Dog Gate and so on against African Americans. The reality is that this conflict between blacks and whites, two groups that get along rather well, believe it or not, that's 5% of crime and it's 80% B on W. So again, a lot of the actual facts here are dramatically counter to these narratives on the left. And I'll say dramatically counter to a lot of these narratives on the hard right as well. But the facts are as they are. The question that I have, as someone who kind of gets paid as a political scientist to look into who presents narratives, is why do we believe so much of this nonsense? And I really do think the mainstream mass media has a lot of blame, a lot of water to carry here. And this goes beyond race, by the way. There's a great book I always recommend in serious interviews, The Culture of Fear by Barry Glasner, where he looks at these epidemic waves of panic that we see in society. A small child kidnapping, that happens less than 80 times a year. Plane crashes, shark attacks, are you going to burst into flames on the operating table? All of this panic is created by individuals that have a financial interest in us rage clicking. And that's a problem. But again, interracial crime, at least in the context we're discussing, 5% of crime, it's not majority white on black. Police shootings of unarmed men, 15 a year if you're talking about African Americans. And we keep seeing real data like this when we look at the actual figures. So my suggestion, read a book, go to the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal on the center right, go to the library, and you'll find things very, very different from what you're often told.
Amazing. So if someone has, we've been hearing a lot of grievances, right? And lived experiences. How do you square that, right? So you have a student comes to you and says, I had a bad interaction with a police officer, and so did my dad, and so did my mom, and so did my cousin, and whatever. And then you come at them with that fact there, and that, so people have this grievance because of an experience they had, and then you come at them with the facts, big picture. How do we square that up?
Well, I don't mean to be rude to anyone, but I am a quant. I think that the facts, the numbers, once we understand the quality of, for example, that crime report, like, yes, this is victim reported. Yes, the majority of these departments are no longer, quote unquote, crooked. Yes, we vet this. I think that once we've gone through that simple process, the actual general facts drawn from millions of people sort of have to matter more. I don't want to ever mock anyone, but my lived experience or my truth is often another way of restating that phrase, my opinion. I'll keep this kind of PG, but I read recently, I was looking through, I think, GQ, one of the magazines I subscribe to, and I read that 96% of men believe they are good vehicle drivers and 98% believe they are good lovers. Don't know whether that's true or not, but that's every man's lived experience. And if I asked my buddies or you were to ask yours, you'd probably hear people say that. Whether or not that's true, that's a totally different story. And we have national car wreck data, at least on one side of that aisle, that keeps track of what the actual facts are. Another thing I will say, I did a brief in-class study of my students once. This wasn't for publication. I was just genuinely interested. But I did some fairly solid methods, and I asked the kids, how many negative experiences do you have in a day? We're talking arguments, we're talking fist fights or light scuffles, traffic interactions, this sort of thing, hostile glances. And the white and black kids reported the exact same amount, which I think was 9.5. But the African-American individuals attributed slightly under half of those to racism. The white kids attributed virtually none of them to racism, but it's the same amount. The black kids maybe experienced 0.1 more. So I definitely think that the more we teach people that and you'll probably now going to start seeing this with whites as well. The more we teach people that there's this hostile racial climate, violence is everywhere, the great races are at one another's throats, the more people are going to believe that. But the real question is, again, how many people are actually going to be the victim of crimes, the victims of police abuse? In the last year on record, the total number of victims of interracial crimes, at least that black-white category, 600,000 out of 340 million. Total number of unarmed men shot by police, again, 15. So the facts are as they are.
Wow, amazing, Professor. Professor, I'm so glad you're like, and I hope you take this as a compliment. You're the new Thomas Sowell. You're the new Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. Is that fair? You're just spitting truth, dropping truth bombs.
Definitely.
That's the finest compliment I could think. I hope you took it that way. Let me give you one. I'm going to give you a hard one here. This is the one the argument I heard, and I was like, yeah, that one, I get that one. Legacy of slavery doesn't work. I heard Thomas Sowell just the other day talked about in 1880, it was somewhere between 85 and 95% of black kids lived in two-parent households in 1880. So there was no legacy of slavery that broke up the family in 1880, and that shouldn't be the case today either. So legacy of slavery doesn't make sense to me, but the legacy of redlining, how do you make sense of that one? I see some potential effects of that making sense. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there are two different things here when you talk about these issues. There's a tendency to stereotype African Americans on. I put myself on kind of the business center right. I jokingly describe myself as a guy with more than one necktie and firearm. But there's a tendency to stereotype black guys in that category or on the right as quote unquote Uncle Toms, people that deny racism. I don't think that that is real for myself or Dr. Soul or Glenn Lowry. I mean, most serious academics that fall within that giant block at all. So, yeah, of course. I mean, there are category characteristics in the black community that have been negatively affected by past racism. But there are 2 points there that have to be made immediately following that, so you avoid sort of just a pattern of excuse making. One, there are many characteristics in the black community and in white communities that don't have anything to do with our past conflict against one another or with past oppression. You mentioned the most obvious of those, which is fatherlessness. You mentioned Walter Williams. In 1938, the great economist looked at actual rates of fatherlessness during a very tough period, right after the Great Depression, before World War II. The rate was 4% for whites, 11% for African Americans. These groups may have literally been in pretty serious conflict with one another, with African Americans dealing with oppression, but both groups took care of their kids. There's no other way to put it. Chinese Americans, the rate was, I believe, 1%, if I recall his data. Now, many years later, a much softer country, we see a very different picture. Those quote-unquote illegitimacy rates, although I dislike the term, are almost 40% for whites, 72% for African Americans, 66% for Native Americans and some Hispanic groups, almost 20% for Asian Americans. So, I mean, that final barrier may be falling here. And there's no way to attribute that to racism. So each question has to stand on its own. An additional point there, obviously, there has been racist abuse throughout America's history. And again, no serious black individual or white individual would deny that. But there has also been a massive expenditure of treasure and blood to compensate for that. I mean, even leaving the Civil War aside, in 1954, the USA took a major step to desegregate the South with Brown v. Board. You're now talking 65 odd years ago. 1964, Civil Rights Act, racism of most varieties, at least discrimination, became civilly and sometimes criminally illegal. 1967, if you look at the first run of the Philadelphia Plan, pro-minority affirmative action took effect. So that's now 53 years old. So if you actually take a complex look at these pictures, you'd expect to see things in the black community that are disadvantages caused by racism, that result from advantages caused by affirmative action, such as upper-end government employment, and other things that are shared by black and white countrymen that don't have much of anything to do with some of this historical conflict or historical oppression at all. And that's what you see with fatherlessness, which is a purely cultural variable, virtually unknown among black men, white men, Hispanic men, and of course, the women in the lives of all those individuals until quite recently.
Amazing. I'm reminded of Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks, White Liberals, to explain the cultural underpinnings of why the ghetto culture is that way, with many different things, and sexual promiscuity being one of them. I want to encourage everyone to read that book. It's one of my favorites. Let me do a devil's advocate. The reason why there are so few fathers in the black community is because of war on drugs, imprisoning black men, which therefore makes them not in the home anymore. I've heard that argument. What do you say to that?
What I have to say to that is that most black men don't go to prison. I mean, I think that there is, to some extent, we want to avoid what's called the soft bigotry of low expectations. So again, I, as a pro-black guy, and also as someone who doesn't want to get stereotyped as defending every crazy social policy, frankly, I always do this clarifier. Of course, there's racism. Of course, the prison system has its issues. I'm libertarian enough that I would probably, with a few exceptions like meth, legalize virtually every drug of pleasure. I don't see any particular reason that keeping most of these illegal can be argued to help black communities or poor white communities or whatnot. But when people argue that these issues at the margins are responsible for, a 700% jump in fatherlessness, that just doesn't make sense. You could possibly argue that the marginal gap between, say, 50% in working class white communities and 70% in black communities is due to some of this. But then why did fatherlessness jump 500% for Caucasians? We're obviously looking at a systemic causal pattern that has to do with things other than racism or ethnic conflict. And one of the things you find with the social justice bloc is that while I don't think we on quote unquote the other side discount racism or ethnic conflict, they often discount everything but those variables. So, I mean, the obvious, intervenor, we would say, there's the welfare state. I mean, in the mid 1960s, we started cash subsidy payments for individuals, principally women, that wanted to begin families that weren't traditional. And you saw fatherlessness spike up from there. And that's not an American phenomenon. I mean, fatherlessness rates are now, I believe, around 40% in Sweden, for example, which is very similar to the rate for at least Caucasians here. So anytime you do something like give people fairly large amounts of money to begin families without necessarily many requirements being tied into that, and I'm not getting into the morality of this or anything else, but you're going to see more of those families. And obviously, I don't think anyone can say that Caucasians in Sweden are being oppressed by anybody. There are economic incentives in the world that matter outside of racism, which is a point made Professor, not only by Mr. Soul, but I think by every economist that's ever lived.
Professor, I got to take a break. Can you stick around for just a few more minutes? I got a few more questions, and you're just crushing it. Is that okay? You got a few more minutes for us?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, you got to buy the books. Hate Crime Hoax, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Wilfred Riley, Kentucky State University. Again, the Twitter is Will Da Beast 630. And follow the professor. More coming up. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I don't want to stop talking to our next guest, Wilfred Riley, Kentucky State University. His books, Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Professor, the other day you tweeted out a stat about household income. Can you please define that first? Because so many things in life we don't properly define. So can you define that and then give us the big fact here?
Yeah, so household income is simply the income that's earned by a tax-recognized household, whether that's a single mother, whether that's a married couple with children, that's an independent, quote-unquote, bachelor income earner, so on down the line. And what I said about household income on Twitter was, again, we need to be, I'm going to give two dorky but important words of advice to your audience: be multivariate. When you look at a difference between any two groups of people, income for men and women, the conventional view in society right now is that that's due to some kind of bigotry. And we're now seeing a backlash from the, in my opinion, god-awful, what's sometimes called alt-right, which argues that these differences are instead due to genetics, perhaps. The reality tends to be a hell of a lot more complex. And that is that a ton of different things, age, region, people's interests, the individuals, the smallest, most important minority, so on, determine how people are going to perform. And looking at these simplistic political constructs gets in the way of just recognizing that. So what I said about household income, I noted that both activists and bigots are very fond of pointing out that Black household income is about 50% of white household income. It's almost exactly 50%. I think we, quote unquote, were at 33,000. Caucasians were at 67,000 as of last year. And I actually unpacked that data a little bit. And what I found was that there's a very simple reason for that. The average Black household has about half as many people. Now, whites are certainly catching up, which is not necessarily a prize you guys want in terms of what we're talking about with fathers and so on. But I mean, in terms of right now, 72% of African-American children are born out of wedlock. So you're going to see that a very, very common household is going to be, hardworking single mom with a couple of kids. So it doesn't make much sense, if any, to say that a mother and two children who are too young to work have half the income of a mother, a father, and two children that are too young to work. Because that's exactly what you'd expect, since they're two people in the second household. So it's very important to actually look at the realities that underlie a lot of these numbers that we hear about. Amazing. This is a point I actually made. I had a good discussion about this in depth on Life, Liberty, and Levin over on the Fox network. But we were talking about income in general, and there's a very famous claim going back to the 90s that the black-white income gap in general is due to racism. And I'm sure at the margin some of it is. But two things you have to adjust for first are age. The most common age for a black man is 27. For a white man, it's 58. You can check that just by Googling Pew,
Really?
most common age for the race.
What's most common age? That's interesting. Is that median age, average age? What is that?
Well, that's the mode. So you don't want to overhype that. That's just the most common, the age where the most individuals at that age. But it's still modes are used as an average. I mean, that's a breakdown of something like a fourth or a third of the individuals in a group. The average gap, just straight up at the mean, is itself large. As I recall, it's more than 10 years. So just adjusting for the fact that they're very different ages. The average age for Jewish Americans is over 40, whereas the average age for some Latin American populations is around 20. So if you say something like, well, there's a fairly high rate in some of these Hispanic communities, or look at all these superstar Hispanic baseball players, you're not necessarily being racist. You might be pointing out things that are statistically accurate. But you then have to ask, well, what would be the case for, say, Italian Americans or any other group, Jewish Americans, if their average age were 20? So when you get into that income stat, you have to look at age. You have to look at where people live. Blacks are more likely to live in the South, African Americans, where wages are lower for everyone, where there aren't necessarily huge black-white gaps in Mississippi, but there are a lot more black guys that live in Mississippi. So it doesn't make sense to compare a black guy in Mississippi with a white guy in Silicon Valley. They might both be doing quite well when you look at what a house costs in Mississippi, but that's going to affect those income distributions. So you have to adjust for all of this. And when you do, you often find maybe a 2 or 3 or 1% gap that could be contemporary racism. We can't ignore that. It's a big starting boost. But when you see something like, well, there's the 30% income gap, just saying, well, that must be prejudice, that's amateurish, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Unbelievable. What's the tweet you sent out this morning from the Brookings Institute? Black households income rising across the U.S. What do we learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we learn is that if you focus on individuals, which, again, kind of center right, bit libertarian, business background, that is who I tend to focus on. I don't think people exist in the midst of massive groups. I mean, most healthy people have a sense of family identification, religion. Most people obviously like their ethnic group, so on. But most people exist at the level of themselves trying to make money in their world. And if you look at people at that level, America's getting substantially better. If you look at pretty much any tested metric, individual income, individual happiness, even IQ scores, if you look at some of that quote unquote Flynn effect research, those are going up among most groups with the small gaps between groups clothing. But I mean, there are some negative social trends like family collapse that are masking that at the larger level. But the black household income thing simply was that even if you're looking at a group of households that often are headed by individuals, the median income now has crossed the 40,000 mark, moving up toward the 45,000 mark. Caucasians, who often now have, again, a great many single-parent households, are a bit under 70,000. So we're seeing people make more money as people. We're just seeing some social problems that are stopping families and communities from doing exactly what they used to do in the past.
Okay, last question. I got like 2 minutes. How do you explain different behaviors, period, but maybe crime in particular, or you can pick any behavior you want, between different ethnic groups / cultures? Why is that?
I think there are a whole lot of things that come into play. Again, without making excuses for any group, African Americans or Southern whites or whatever, age is another big factor. Obviously, if you're 27, you're more likely to commit crimes than if you're 58. Poverty is another factor, and that does tie back into historical prejudice. If you overall have less income and wealth, you're more likely to commit certain crimes such as robbery. I will note that Caucasians dominate corporate crime. So we're not looking at a moral difference between people. We're looking at what sort of crime do you have access to? Again, I'd say the big one for, if you're talking about specifically high crime demographics, I already mentioned blacks and quote unquote poor whites. Absence of a father is a big one. The thing that I would say about all of this is that you can't get down to one variable. You can't just say, well, if the church was more present, crime would go away, or one individual thing. Be multivariate. There are a ton of different things that work together to explain these complex patterns we see between groups. When you look at blacks versus whites, you see a younger population, a more urban population, a population with more father issues. I mean, a dozen other things, a more southern population where there's less money. And if you adjusted for all those things, then you'd be able to compare people equally. But as in the world as it exists, it's often hard to. So you see differences.
How dare you?
But you can't just
How
attribute
dare
those
you?
differences to prejudice or any one other thing.
How dare you encourage people to speak and think in nuance and define terms and look deeper into issues? Professor, what an honor to talk to you, sir. The book, Hate Crime Hoax, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Will DeBeast, 630 on the Twitter. Professor, an honor, sir. Let's do it again.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me on. Enjoyed it.
Great stuff. True story. Mike Slater. We'll do it again tomorrow. Spread the word.